On the cold morning of January 7, 1945, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower clutched a transcript that threatened to shatter the very foundation of the Western Alliance, while Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton stood on the verge of open mutiny. Could a single press conference by the arrogant British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery actually lose the war for the Allies, just as victory seemed within their grasp? The conflict that erupted in the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge was not merely a disagreement over tactics, but a violent collision of national egos and military philosophies that had been simmering since the North African sands of 1942. To understand why Eisenhower's hands shook with rage as he read Montgomery's words, one must look back to the turning point at El Alamein, where the British Eighth Army stood at a desperate crossroads under a scorching sun. For 2 long years, the British forces had been humiliated, outmaneuvered, and pushed across the desert by the legendary Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, until Bernard Law Montgomery arrived to instill a methodical, almost obsessive discipline into his troops. Montgomery spent weeks meticulously stockpiling supplies, ensuring every bullet was accounted for, and training his men for a set-piece battle that would eventually break the German lines on October 23, 1942. This marked the first major British land victory against Nazi Germany, and just like that, the church bells rang across Britain for the first time since the war began. Montgomery was instantly transformed from a career officer into a messianic national hero who represented the return of British military competence and the hope of an empire. However, this sudden fame fueled a pre-existing dormant arrogance in Montgomery, leading him to believe that he alone possessed the strategic genius required to defeat the Wehrmacht. He began to view his American counterparts not as equals, but as well-meaning yet dangerously inexperienced amateurs who lacked the professional polish of the British military establishment. By the time the Allied armies were poised for the liberation of Europe, Montgomery considered himself the only natural choice for overall ground command, and he viewed Eisenhower's appointment as Supreme Allied Commander as a mere political compromise rather than a recognition of superior military ability. Eisenhower, meanwhile, was managing a coalition of unprecedented complexity, balancing the conflicting demands of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, while trying to keep volatile generals like Patton and Montgomery from tearing each other apart. The British contribution to the war effort had been immense since 1939, but by 1945, the industrial and manpower weight of the United States had shifted the balance of power decisively, with Americans providing nearly 75% of the forces on the Western Front. Winston Churchill, desperate to maintain Britain's status as a global superpower, backed Montgomery at every turn, frequently intervening with Roosevelt to ensure British commanders maintained influence far beyond their actual troop numbers. This delicate political architecture meant that Eisenhower could not simply fire Montgomery for his eccentricities or his condescending attitude, because doing so would be seen as a direct insult to the British Empire and the British public who adored their Monty. Even when Montgomery's strategic gambles failed spectacularly, such as the disastrous Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Eisenhower found himself forced to absorb the blame. Market Garden had been Montgomery's brainchild, a plan to drop 3 airborne divisions behind enemy lines, to seize bridges in the Netherlands and end the war by Christmas. Yet it resulted in over 17,000 casualties and the near destruction of the British 1st Airborne Division. Instead of accepting responsibility, Montgomery immediately pivoted to blaming American logistics and Eisenhower's broad front strategy, claiming his single thrust in Germany would have worked if only he had been given absolute priority over all other American armies. Suddenly, the tension reached a breaking point in December 1944 when Hitler launched his Rhine offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Caught off guard in the Ardennes forest, American lines buckled under the weight of heavy panzer divisions, creating a massive salient that threatened to split the Allied front. In a moment of pragmatic crisis management, Eisenhower made the fateful decision to place the American 1st and 9th Armies under Montgomery's temporary command because the German advance had physically cut them off from their original American headquarters. Montgomery did not see this as a temporary operational necessity. He saw it as a long-awaited admission of his superiority. While American soldiers were freezing in the foxholes of Bastogne and dying by the thousands to blunt the German spearhead, Montgomery was preparing a narrative that would place himself at the absolute center of the victory. He viewed the American struggle not as a testament to the grit of the individual GI, but as a failure of American leadership that only British methodical planning could rectify. As General George Patton executed a brilliant 90-degree turn with his Third Army to relieve the besieged Americans, Montgomery remained cautious, holding back his forces until he felt every detail was perfect. This delay infuriated General Omar Bradley and General Patton, who felt their men were being sacrificed while Montgomery waited for the perfect moment to step into the limelight. By early January, the German offensive had been broken, largely due to the incredible resilience of American units like the 101st Airborne. But Montgomery decided this was the moment to call the world press to his headquarters. The press conference on January 7th was a masterpiece of passive aggression. Montgomery described the American troops as being in a state of total chaos and confusion before he arrived to tidy up the battlefield. He spoke to the reporters as if he were a schoolmaster, explaining the mistakes of his students, claiming that he had personally organized the defense and that the victory belonged to his strategic intervention. Every word was a calculated blow to American prestige, implying that without British leadership, the American army would have been wiped out. When the transcripts reached Eisenhower's headquarters, the reaction was instantaneous and visceral. General Omar Bradley, usually the most level-headed of men, was so livid that he told Eisenhower he would rather resign his commission and go home than serve another day alongside the British Field Marshal. Patton was even more explosive, declaring that Montgomery's insults to the American dead were a disgrace that required an immediate and public response. Eisenhower found himself trapped in a nightmare. He was caught between the fury of his most essential field commanders and the certain knowledge that firing Montgomery would cause Churchill to erupt and possibly lead to a permanent split in the Anglo-American alliance. The crisis was no longer about a battle in the Ardennes. It was about the survival of the coalition that was supposed to liberate the world from tyranny. Eisenhower knew that if Bradley and Patton resigned, the American public would lose all confidence in the war effort and the command structure would collapse. Yet if he fired Montgomery, he risked a diplomatic catastrophe that would delight Hitler in his bunker. He sat at his desk in Versailles, the order for Montgomery's relief drafted and waiting for his signature. The weight of the decision was suffocating as the winter wind rattled the windows. He had commanded the invasions of North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, but this internal struggle was proving more difficult than any amphibious assault. He understood that Montgomery was a brilliant tactical mind, but a disastrous diplomat. A man who could win a battle but lose a peace through sheer vanity. Just as Eisenhower prepared to finalize the removal of the British national hero, the phone lines between London and Washington began to hum with the frantic energy of diplomats trying to prevent a total breakdown of the Allied front. Churchill had been alerted to the American fury and realized that his favorite general had finally pushed Eisenhower too far. The British Prime Minister knew he had to act quickly to save Montgomery from himself. But the Field Marshal remained blissfully unaware of the storm he had created. The tension inside the Allied camp was so thick that operations against the retreating Germans actually began to suffer as commanders refused to speak to one another across the national divide. It was a moment of supreme irony where the greatest military alliance in history was being brought to its knees by a few paragraphs of boastful dialogue. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Bedell Smith, worked through the night to find a middle ground. He knew that the Ike personality, the smiling, consensus-building leader, was being pushed toward a ruthlessness he had seldom shown. The American generals were not asking for an apology. They were asking for a divorce from Montgomery's influence. They demanded that no American soldier ever again be placed under his command. This was the ultimate test of Eisenhower's leadership. He looked at the relief order one last time, his pen hovering over the paper, knowing that whatever he chose would define the final months of the war. The strategic implications were massive. If Montgomery were removed, who would lead the northern wing of the invasion into Germany? The British public would be outraged, and the morale of the British troops, who viewed Monty as their savior, might plummet. Conversely, if Eisenhower did nothing, he would lose the respect of the American army. He decided to send a final, blunt message to Montgomery through Guingand, informing him that the boss was at the end of his tether. Meanwhile, in the snow-covered fields of the Ardennes, the ordinary soldiers continued to fight and die, unaware that their commanders were embroiled in a civil war of words. The logistics of the war continued to grind forward, but the spirit of cooperation had evaporated. Every request from Montgomery was now viewed with suspicion, and every American success was touted with extra vigor to counter his narrative. The political pressure from Washington was also mounting. Roosevelt was being briefed on the Montgomery problem, and the American press was beginning to catch wind of the rift. If the story broke that the British were belittling American sacrifices, the Germany First strategy itself could be called into question by the American public. Eisenhower was fighting a war on three fronts: the Germans, his subordinates, and the politicians back home. He realized that his role as Supreme Commander meant he was a prisoner to the politics of the leaders he served. He had to be a statesman as much as a general. He began to draft a series of cables to Marshall and Churchill, trying to explain the volatility of the situation without sounding like he was losing control. The stress was taking a visible toll on his health. The clock was ticking, the German retreat was accelerating, and a decision had to be made before the next phase of the offensive began. Eisenhower called a secret meeting with his closest advisors. The room was tense, the air thick with cigarette smoke. They debated the pros and cons of sacking Montgomery until the early hours of the morning. Finally, Eisenhower stood up and dismissed his staff. He needed a moment of silence to make the call that would change history. He looked out at the dark gardens of Versailles, thinking of the thousands of men who were depending on him to get this right. The future of the Western world hung in the balance of a single signature. The pen remained poised over the relief order as Eisenhower grappled with the reality that his theoretical authority was being choked by the vines of international diplomacy. While the American generals waited for a sign of strength, the British chief of the Imperial General Staff delivered an urgent message from Winston Churchill. Churchill understood with terrifying clarity that the alliance was on the precipice of a total rupture. In a tense conversation, the Prime Minister acknowledged Montgomery's tactless nature, but warned that firing him would be seen as a sacrifice of military merit to satisfy American pride. Churchill argued that such a move would force him to defend Montgomery publicly, potentially turning the British people against the alliance at the exact moment unity was needed to face the looming shadow of the Soviet Union. Eisenhower countered that his own commanders were ready to walk away. The American public would not tolerate their soldiers being slandered by a man whose ego seemed larger than the front line. Searching for a desperate compromise, Churchill proposed that Montgomery issue a private letter of apology. Eisenhower was skeptical, knowing that a mere letter might not satisfy men like Patton and Bradley, who had seen their soldiers bleed in the snow while Montgomery claimed the glory. To ensure the plan worked, Churchill dispatched Major General Francis de Guingand, Montgomery's own chief of staff and closest friend, to deliver a brutal reality check to the Field Marshal. When de Guingand arrived at the headquarters on January 10th, he found Montgomery in high spirits, genuinely believing his press conference had been a triumph. The general wasted no time in shattering this delusion, informing Montgomery that a relief order was sitting on Eisenhower's desk, ready for a signature that would end his career in absolute disgrace. Montgomery was stunned. He had believed his status as a military genius made him untouchable. De Guingand made the stakes crystal clear. Either Montgomery wrote a gracious apology immediately, or he would be sent home as the man who almost broke the alliance. Under the watchful eye of his chief of staff, Montgomery began the agonizing process of drafting a letter. The final document expressed deep regret for the misunderstanding and finally offered praise for the courage of the American soldiers who had held the line at Bastogne. While it was a politician's apology, carefully avoiding a direct admission of wrongdoing, it provided Eisenhower with the diplomatic leverage he needed. When Eisenhower presented the letter to Bradley and Patton, the reaction was far from celebratory. Patton dismissed the text as garbage. Seeing through the careful phrasing, however, Bradley recognized that they had achieved their primary goal of putting Montgomery in his place. Bradley agreed to withdraw his resignation on the strict condition that all American armies be returned to American command immediately, and that Montgomery never again hold operational authority over U.S. troops. Satisfied that the military balance had been restored, Eisenhower reached for the relief order and tore it into pieces. The aftermath of the crisis fundamentally reshaped the Allied command. Eisenhower's relationship with Montgomery became cold and strictly professional. Montgomery had learned that his fame had limits, and Churchill's protection ended where the survival of the alliance began. For the rest of the campaign, Eisenhower ignored Montgomery's frequent pleas for a single thrust strategy. As the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and converged on the heart of Germany, the internal scars of the January crisis remained. American generals never truly forgave the insult, and a lingering resentment permeated the high command, even as victory became certain. When Germany finally surrendered on May 7, 1945, the public celebrated a seamless victory, unaware of how close the structure had come to collapsing. Montgomery would spend his post-war years writing memoirs that insisted he had been right all along, claiming the war could have ended months earlier if his genius had been unfettered. History, however, records a different story, one of a supreme commander who understood that winning a war required more than just moving divisions on a map. Eisenhower's decision to manage Montgomery rather than fire him was a masterpiece of political restraint. He lived with the frustration of a subordinate he could not trust because the alternative was a fractured alliance that might have allowed the war to drag on. This forgotten chapter serves as a stark reminder that the greatest battles are often fought within the headquarters of the victors. The clash was a struggle for the soul of the coalition. In the end, Eisenhower's leadership flow proved superior to Montgomery's tactical brilliance. The ability to hold a team together is the most vital weapon in any commander's arsenal. The legacy of this confrontation extended far beyond the battlefields of Europe, influencing the structure of NATO and the Cold War alliances that followed. It proved that a coalition of democracies, despite their internal bickering, could maintain a unified front. Montgomery remained a hero to the British, but to the Americans, his name became synonymous with unchecked ambition. For the soldiers on the ground, the drama in the high command was invisible, yet their lives depended on its resolution. If Eisenhower had signed that order, the resulting chaos could have stalled the final offensive into Germany, costing thousands of lives. By choosing compromise, Eisenhower ensured that the focus remained on the destruction of the Nazi regime. The Battle of the Bulge was not just Hitler's last gamble. It was the final trial for the Allied high command. It forced men to confront their own weaknesses and the fragility of their partnership. The victory was a triumph of endurance, both on the front line and in the war rooms. Even as the guns fell silent over Berlin, the tension between the British and American perspectives remained. The incident solidified the United States as the dominant partner in the Western Alliance. In the final analysis, Dwight Eisenhower proved that the most effective way to deal with a problematic subordinate is not always to remove them, but to contain them. He turned a moment of disaster into a demonstration of American diplomatic strength. The story is a cautionary tale for any leader. It shows how easily a single moment of arrogance can threaten years of hard-won progress. As we look back on 1945, we must recognize that the peace we enjoy was bought with the blood of soldiers and the incredible patience of leaders who knew when to swallow their pride for the sake of the world. The silence of the history books on this near collapse of the alliance speaks to how well the cover-up worked, but the documents tell a more human, fractured story. Montgomery continued to be a thorn in Eisenhower's side during the post-war occupation of Germany. Their disputes over how to handle the defeated nation and the rising Soviet threat mirrored their wartime disagreements. Eisenhower eventually moved on to the presidency, where he applied the lessons of the Montgomery affair to international crises like Suez. Montgomery, on the other hand, became more isolated in his views, increasingly at odds with the modernizing military of the 1950s. The archives at the Eisenhower Presidential Library contain the original drafts of the angry cables and the torn-up relief order. They serve as physical evidence of the rage that nearly changed the course of World War II. The Ike grin masked a steel resolve that was tested most by his own allies. The British perspective on the event remains protective of Montgomery's military legacy. Many British historians argue that his tidying up of the front was a necessary tactical reality, even if his words were chosen poorly. They point to the fact that the 1st and 9th Armies were indeed under his command during the crisis, and that his professional handling of the Northern Shoulder was exemplary. This divergence in historical memory continues to color the shared history of the two nations. Ultimately, the alliance survived because the goal was greater than the men who led it. The liberation of Western Europe and the destruction of the Nazi death machine were objectives that neither Eisenhower nor Churchill could allow to be derailed. They were men of their time, bound by duty and burdened by the weight of millions of lives. The story of January 7th is the story of how that burden was almost too much to bear. Do you believe Eisenhower made the right choice by keeping Montgomery in command for the sake of the alliance? Or should he have stood up for American honor and ferried him regardless of the political costs? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.